Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 11th of April. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, actions speak louder than words. Australia talks trade with China but acts war. Bring down the big five gang of banks to save farming, manufacturing and the nation. And finally, your super is trapped in a rigged game and you're the sucker. First, actions speak louder than words. Australia talks trade with China but acts war. So, Craig, Tony Abbott has taken what I call an armada of big business representatives.
Including two billionaires.
600 person delegation to North Asia, Japan, South Korea and China, right? And it's a big free trade push. So he's got a free trade deal with Japan that he's raving about, free trade deal with South Korea. They want to finalise a free trade deal with China.
Except all the reports coming out afterwards, Robbie, it isn't really what it's cracked up to be. I mean, a lot of people are complaining about the fact that whilst there's all this hoopla about it, the actual deals being done are not that significant in terms of. But also, what worries me and concerns me is that you've got to think about what's happening, for example, to the farmers in Japan. We know what's happening with the farmers here in Australia under free trade, but what's happening to the farmers in Japan? How are they being smashed? How are their support incomes and so forth being attacked? Well,
and that's a good point. You would find if you examine these deals, we had a high-profile free trade deal with America 10 years ago after the Iraq War, right? And who benefited? Not the individual producer in Australia. Big business, multinational corporations set up in both countries are usually the beneficiaries of these things. And what you raise about the Japanese farmers is key because Japan has been fiercely protective of its agriculture for a long time, right? Fiercely protective. Why would it water that down for Australia? Well, it's because I suspect that there's a bigger game afoot which has nothing to do with trade. It's about military matters, right? So the issue that we want to concentrate on is what else Abbott did in Japan. He was the first foreign representative of another country to attend Japan's National Security Council meeting. Now, Craig, just to recap briefly for those who don't know, after World War II, Japan, like Germany, were basically forbidden from having armies, right? But that World War II was now 70 years ago or so. So that's been watered down in the recent decade or so. And Japan and Germany again becoming militarized, which is, that's not an issue per se, but it's what are they going to do with that, right? What Japan is doing with its militarization is it's got this sideways dispute with China over these disputed islands in the territory, in the seas surrounding them, right? For us to be participating in a military level, very high military level meeting with Japanese, we are sending a message to China. Now, the message is more serious than people might think because in the last few years, the British and Americans, and I mean the British explicitly, have been pushing this idea that there should be an Asian equivalent of NATO. So you've got NATO in Europe, right, which is the defence pact there that comes from a product of the Cold War, right, which is basically America working with European militaries to defend against the Soviets. Well, there's no Soviets anymore, and Malcolm Fraser's argument when the Cold War fell was that NATO should have been disbanded because it didn't have a purpose anymore. They've kept it going and they've actually expanded NATO to be able to use it as the military way of dictating the world, right? It's the military side of the British or the Anglo-American Empire. It's
like a partial fulfilment of the British idea, the British Empire's idea of a one world army.
That's right.
And the point is to contain Russia in terms of NATO, and Russia has a very strong sense of its own national sovereignty, and it doesn't want to see that impeded. But when you're talking about the British Empire, you're talking about the destruction of sovereignty. So you have these two principles being, played out in the sense of this military alliance, which is actually defunct, as Mr. Fraser said. It's finished. It should have been got rid of.
Exactly. There's no purpose for it.
It should have been.
They've kept it going because of what
global Eurasian development, as Lyndon LaRouche talked about his proposals for a productive triangle, the development of Eurasia through large-scale infrastructure. But see, that was smashed again by the Bush administration and the first Bush administration, because of this British idea of containing Russia, of making sure you can try and destroy any form of national sovereignty anywhere.
And they explicitly would like Australia, Japan and the United States to form the foundation of an Asian NATO. Other countries like the Philippines might get involved, etc. But who's it targeted at? It's all targeted at China, right? Yeah. And officially we say it's not, but they're not as dumb as we'd hope they are. They know it is. Now, proving, Craig, that there are people, and this might shock viewers, there are actually people in Australia, in America, in Britain, etc., who want a war. They want war with China, they want war with Russia. We've got this, there's a very prominent defence academic in Australia named Hugh White, who used to be the Deputy Secretary of Defence. He is, he's sort of seized on the tension over Ukraine, right, where now Russia is being painted as the aggressor, to lump Russia and China in together and say what the West needs to do is impose conditions on those countries that they know they will not accept, but then use their not acceptance of those conditions as the pretext for war, right? Specifically, he's saying China should be forced to give up the use of force or its threat to use force to settle disputes. Now that sounds nice, but I'll make 2 points. China will, China, if you look at the relationship between China and Taiwan, right? China regards Taiwan as part of China and vice versa, frankly, but Taiwan's not much of a threat to China. And China, there's still a war footing there, right? But there has been, Craig, for 60 years. China hasn't acted on that. But it's not going to drop that just because the Americans tell it to, right? They're not going to back down. The other reason they're not going to back down is this. Does America reserve the right to use force wherever it wants? Of course it does. Yeah. If America says this is a situation that we regard as a threat to our national interests, including the Iraq War, for crying out loud, use force, right? So China's not going to do that, and therefore what Hugh White is pushing is guaranteed to lead to the preconditions for war. And this is the guy who was, when he was in the Defence Department, was the author of the Defence White Paper in the year 2000, which basically turned the United States, Australia, into one giant US military base, all targeted at China. Now, I've got a question for you, but before I do, let me just make this point. When we say they deny it's targeted at China, and the Chinese know better, we have a very good example now in Europe, because in Europe, NATO is expanding eastward. They set up these forward bases in countries like Poland and Romania, former Soviet bloc countries, right? And the Russians said, these are targeted at us. And they put in these ballistic missile defense installations. And the Russians said, these are targeted at us. And they were told, no, they're not targeted at you, they're targeted at Iran. Iran's the big threat to Europe, they're targeted at Iran.
Yeah, that's right.
Now that there's this showdown with Russia, all of a sudden, what are those bases, what are they openly using those bases for, those forward bases for NATO? Targeting at Russia. And they're open about it, which is why they were there all along. So, Craig, it would seem incredible to most reasonable people that there are people who actually want war between nuclear powers, and it's even more incredible that there are Australians who would want us to go to war with China. So just explain to the viewers, because this is a crucial thing, why is this the British imperial strategy?
Well, the intention, Rob, as I said before, is you cannot have in any sort of empire, any sort of mindset like an empire where you have this elite that think that they can, like Little Rouge refers to all the time, like Zeus, that they can lord it over everyone else. Therefore, what you have with China and with Russia is this very, very profound sense of national sovereignty, which they will defend. I mean, just this last week, I mean, you saw a really good intervention by the Chinese against the Secretary of Defence, Chuck Hagel, when he was in there, because what you saw in the various media conferences was the Chinese stating very clearly to Hagel, don't push us. He said, with the latest developments in China, it can never be contained. This is what the Defence Minister Cheng Wen-Quan said against
China can never be contained.
China can never be contained. The US is, and he says, a quote, a country of worldwide influence, and the Pacific Ocean is huge enough to hold both China and the US for common development, and also huge enough to make it clear, huge enough to hold the other Asian Pacific countries. In other words, this region is big enough for all of us. And see, up in up in the European areas, up in the Atlantic Oceans up the north, right, there are these disputed areas, but they create treaties whereby each country agrees to use that area or that land according to a common treaty. The same thing could be done here. But the intention of the Anglo-Americans, of the British that are driving this, is to create war because they want to smash the sovereignty or any element of sovereignty from either China in this particular case or in the northern areas of Russia. Yeah, because this represents an absolute danger to the British Empire, because if you have this principle of national sovereignty expressing itself globally, right, actually other countries say, well, we want to be sovereign as well, it means an empire can't exist.
Now, you've got a map to illustrate this.
Yeah, look, this map here, Robbie, of the British Empire. Look, people say, oh, the British Empire doesn't exist. But if you go back a couple of hundred years, the British Empire was very much in existence. You only have to go back 60 years. The British Empire was still very much in existence. It used to call itself the British Empire. And now here in Australia, we've got knighthoods coming back, right? Like this thing of, this is a function of an empire. You have knights.
So muckety muck and the rest.
Exactly. And you have a look at this particular
so this has been
map,
produced by EIR News Service.
Yeah, and you can see actually how Russia is completely surrounded.
Russia and China. The whole Eurasian region, Craig, is completely surrounded.
There's an anomaly here of Argentina, and you can see why it's being smashed at the moment too. But you can see the yellow represents the British Commonwealth areas, right? You've got current flashpoints for war, and you can see that's in the orange. NATO countries are a bit darker, and then you've got this drug issue. And I think the drug issue is a huge one, because what's happened now is that the US has suspended any collaboration with Russia over fighting the international drug trade, right? So Mr. Ivanov,
the
drug czar in Russia, has made it absolutely clear that this means that you're going to see, in effect, de facto war on the Russian borders through the amount of drug money that's being allowed to come in.
And this was a very convenient thing to suspend collaboration over, because what Lyndon LaRouche, back in the 70s, first documented at the heart of the City of London system is its control of the world's drug trade. Yeah. And that's been borne out in recent years with all these London banks caught money laundering, etc., and getting away with it.
This is how
the Russians have been trying to crack down on it.
This is how you fund mercenary armies to fight against asymmetric warfare against sovereign nation states. Yeah. This is how you do it. So it's
and the thing with this map, Craig, what people have to understand, we're in the yellow in Australia. Put yourself inside that grey bit in Eurasia. That's the way they see it. They look around. They look at the world around them, and they see this encirclement of them, but they're not going to back down.
No, and it's just seen. The containment of China is not an option.
Yep. All right, so that's in the that's on the EIR website, the larouchepack.com website, and you can actually see that in EIR magazine. Which, if you don't subscribe to EIR magazine, you should give us a call, and you can get a subscription. But we report on this because people, we can't pick daisies in a minefield while this is happening around us. And if Australians, 99% of us would totally oppose the idea of a war with China, well, don't pretend it's not happening. Scream about it, and we can make sure it stops happening and take Australia out of the picture, and that'll help undermine it worldwide. But anyway, we've run out of time for that. When we come back, we're going to talk about the acute necessity to bring down the Big Five banking gang in Australia. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Bring down the Big Five gang of banks to save farming, manufacturing and the nation. Craig, we're at a point in Australia where the economic collapse is actually terminal, right? And you've got, we're going to talk about farming here today mostly, but it's just across the board. You've got an implosion in manufacturing, right? And we don't have to tell the viewers about that, but they all know it. We've documented in our New Citizen a couple of years ago what we call the slow nuclear, war on Australia, where you've got things like real family farms down to less than 40,000 in this country, and there's a rate in WA that's quite shocking. In 25 years, the number of family farmers in the wheat belt of Western Australia has dropped from 20,000 to 4,400. And just on that, I was talking to one of them the other day. He's over 60, and he was complaining to me that every weekend he gets called up and asked to fill in and the local footy team, because they don't, they're ghost
60.
towns. At 60, they're
Oh,
ghost
man.
towns. There's hardly anyone around, right? They want to maintain this kind of social stuff. And he's saying to them, listen, at my age, I just want to stand there and have a beer and watch you play footy. I don't want to have to fill in, right? But this is just indicative. It's one of those things. So that collapse is rapid, and my point is it's terminal. And then if you look at, I've noticed in the last 48 hours, there's a huge attention being put on pensions, right? And Joe Hockey gave this speech overnight where he said pensions should be a safety net, but they've become a cargo net. And so he's preparing the population for some kind of cut to pensions, which is not surprising considering what they've done in Greece and all that kind of stuff. But the argument is we can't afford them. Within 15 years, the cost of pensions will be the same as what the GST raises every year, which is $95 billion. Can't afford it. So you're going to have to cut, or you're going to have to whack the pension age up to 70 or something, right? Whereas the bottom line is we can't afford it because we have destroyed our productive industries and the productive workers in those industries whose work creates the wealth that can look after everybody.
Yeah,
right?
well, that's why we're talking about this gang of the Big Five, Robbie, because we're talking about a system here of the Big Five banks that are completely and utterly rooted in speculation.
Yep.
Like, if you have a look, just look at this enormous profit of this banking system, Robbie, and ask the question. This is a private banking system for themselves. Macquarie Bank is one of the Big Five, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I think everyone knows what the other Big Four are, but the Macquarie Bank has made its money through the pure deregulation of the system and the speculation of creating instruments that are nothing more than gambling instruments. And they made a huge amount of money. But at the same time they're doing this, the productive economy, like you can get money lent to you to buy a house, at 103% of the value of the house. Yep. But if you're a farmer in the back box of Western Australia, you're a high risk because you've got to deal with the weather, you've got to deal with international markets. Therefore the banks will say to you, whilst you've got lots of collateral, lots of assets, they'll give you money at 6%. Or 7% or a bit more, right? Providing you're a pretty big operator. But as soon as you have a bad year, your interest rate goes up. As soon as you have a second bad year, it goes up and up and up. And your interest rates can go from, say, 7 or 8% to 17%, and then you're deemed, by no fault of your own, to be an unacceptable risk for the bank and therefore a subject for foreclosure. Yep. Now, this is the system that we're in, and this is the system that has to be brought down from the point of view of re-implementing Glass-Steagall, which we've talked about a lot on this program, of breaking up the Big Five banks, going back to a system where you have a regulated commercial banking system that is designed and regulated by something like the Commonwealth Bank, that we used to have, for the purposes of the productive economy. And the rest of it, the merchant banking, the investment banking, the stockbroking houses, the insurance companies, are all broken out of the banking system and separated out. So you don't have this speculation dumped upon the normal commercial banking system.
Yeah, because if we don't do that, there's not going to, the figures I've just given, there's not going to be anything less.
That's right.
Left, right? Now, we did a release this week that kind of documents this in the case of Landline on the ABC, showed on the WA wheat belt this bloke, Peter Rapaccioli, what happened to him is exactly what you said. He was paying 8.5% interest, and in June, Bankwest whacked that up to 13.62% interest, and now he's gone. Right, he's been foreclosed on, and it's a 102-year-old farm. And the Agriculture Minister in WA, who's this real fool, Ken Baston, said, that's just like any other business. Well, it's not. This is our food security. Last week, Craig, we were talking about our energy security. We're letting market forces dictate whether we have fuel refineries in Australia. We're not going to have it anymore. This is our food security, and that has to take precedence over any kind of rights the banks might think they have.
Yeah, well, I know we're coming up to a break shortly, but I want to talk about this nature of this so-called free trade system, because it's not free trade. It's not anywhere near free or fair, and it's a product of the global financial and monetary system that we have today.
Well, let's take a break and we'll come back and talk about that. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So before the break, Craig, we were talking about what the necessity to bust up the Big Five banking gangs' control over Australia. But you wanted to talk about why what they call free trade ain't free trade.
Okay, what we're talking about when we talk about free trade is British free trade. Now, you have to go back a couple of hundred years and look at exactly what this was. This was the British East India Company, the bastion of the British Empire, that created the slave trade, or was part of the slave trade in East and Western Africa. What did it do? It created slaves. It brought those slaves to the southern part of the United States to grow cotton, a monoculture, right?
Yep.
It forced the people of the southern slave states to grow cotton. It then took that cotton and exported it to India. It then forced the Indians to import the cotton to make cheap cloth. No, sorry, it went up. Sorry, first of all, it went up to England, right? Into Manchester, into the factories up there where they used child slave labour to create the cloth. They then exported that cloth to India,
Dumped on the Indian industry.
Dumped on the Indian people, right? In the meantime, you've got all these merchants taking all their money,
Yep.
the value out. So they dumped the cloth onto the Indians and forced them to produce opium, which was then exported to China and sold to the Chinese for silver. Now, all the while, you have all these merchants in between, which was British merchants, picking up the profits. And this is exactly what's taking place today. It's not got, think about the Africans, the child slave labour in Britain, the Indians that are forced to grow opium, the Chinese that are forced to consume opium, right? Where is the general welfare of the people under this system? This is classic free trade. This is what our parliamentarians support on both sides of the fence, and what you'll see playing out in Australia today at the level of our farmers and our manufacturers is the same system. The benefits of Tony Abbott's free trade agreement with Japan, with China and Korea are going to be the large multinational corporations that are very similar to what were the same corporations 200 years ago. There's not much difference. They're there simply to make profits for the private individual.
So if we're going to ensure we have industries that do produce things like crucial things like the food we need, don't we need to go to a parity pricing system?
You have to go to a parity pricing system, which is a reflection of the principle of the idea of a government supporting the general welfare and the security of its people. You say, we want to have food producers, therefore we're going to support thousands of small producers that make a contribution to society through the small towns that we used to have. These large corporations, they'll put in railroads to the, like you see in the British Empire, they'll put railroads in to the mines, to the coast, but they won't develop the infrastructure of the country. They won't put any more into local towns than they actually have to, because the intention is private profit. Now, where you've got private profit of large multinational corporations or large corporations in conflict with the general welfare, which is the actual role of government, then who's going to lose out? The people. And this is what we see with the banking system. That's why Glass-Steagall is crucial, to bring down this banking system, to break it up, to get them weaned off, well, actually not weaned off, but basically going cold turkey off their debt and speculation. And that means that, you know, a new Commonwealth Bank, a national credit bank, to create large amounts of credit which will go directly to the farmers that we see get kicked off landline. 3%, 2% credit over 25, 30 years will see an absolute flourishment of the production of this country. And that's what we actually represent as an organisation. That's what we've got to get back to.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Craig. So we've run out of time. We were going to talk about the rigged stock market game called high frequency trading, Craig, but we'll do that probably next week. People can look it up in the meantime, because it's just a symptom of the same thing, that we've got a parasitical system that's able to prey on the general population. It's the government's role to stop that, and we've got to make the government do it. So that's it. Thanks for tuning into the CEC Report. Tune in next week for more.